From WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, welcome. I'm Warren Odess Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that examines contemporary issues based on the principles of the Baha'i faith. Today I'm playing a pre-recorded interview with Mr. Ash Hartwell, a Baha'i from Amherst, Massachusetts. Ash has traveled to many countries in Africa, including Egypt, Ghana, Uganda, and Malawi, applying learning principles to classroom, school, and community programs. Since he returned to the U.S. after working 25 years in Africa, he has served as an education advisor to USAID's Africa Bureau, as well as to UNICEF, CARE, and the World Bank. He has served on the Board of Trustees of the 21st Century Learning Initiative, a transnational program to synthesize the best of research and development into the nature of human learning and implications for education, work, and the development of communities worldwide. In 2002, he joined the faculty at the Center for International Education at the University of Massachusetts, where he focuses on learning in post-conflict situations, educational policy and planning, and alternative forms of education. He also continues as an advisor on education systems for the Global Learning Group of the Education Development Center, Inc. The stories that Ash has to tell are too many to capture in 1 hour, so I've segmented our interview into 3 parts. This first segment starts out with his family and individual background, and then his first experience outside of the country as one of the first contingent of Peace Corps volunteers. His assignment was to Ethiopia. Ash is a very animated interviewee, and getting him to keep in front of the mic was a challenge. Therefore, at times, you'll hear him fade in and out. But be patient, for he does eventually return to the microphone. I started the interview by asking Ash where he grew up and what was it like growing up there.
I had the good fortune, or otherwise, of being born in Boston in the Line-In Hospital when my dad was a medical intern after medical school. But our roots were in Hawaii, and it took us. I was born in 1940, and we started out for Hawaii, but had to stop in California because of Pearl Harbor. At that time, you didn't fly so much. You had to take the ships. It was still that time in history, and we couldn't move on because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we were held in California for about 6 months, waiting to see what happened. And after about 6 months, we went out there. And my dad, who went to work in the Tripler Army Hospital, which was where all the casualties from the Pacific went. So I grew up in Hawaii. We lived out in a place called Portlock, which is now multi-million-dollar, really upscale houses. But then we lived across from a pig farm and about a half a mile from a tank camp. And the tanks, this is my boyhood. I mean, I don't know how I got into peace where I am now and goodwill towards men, because basically 3 times a week the tanks would come out into the water in front of our house. We were right on the ocean, and the tanks would roll out in front of our house and go for practice about 3 times a week. It was really noisy. My parents hated it, and I just loved it. I thought that was really cool. Other things about Hawaii, we had to black out our windows because we never, there was the idea of curfews, and so for a long time, towards the middle of the war. And other things were like my dad was one of his classmates was in the Air Force, and when they came to Hawaii, when they came back into port, we'd know about it because they'd have these one-engine fighter Spitfires. They'd come down, and they'd buzz our house, and we'd know Charlie Arabino was in town, and we could expect steaks. Food was really tight during the war, and but on the carriers and the military had them. So he'd bring steaks to us, and we'd know when Charlie Arabino buzzed our house with his squadron of Spitfires that we were in for a good meal. So Anyway, but I was swimming and surfing as soon as I was walking, and went to a school called Hartwell-01, which was set up and run by a family who hired a woman who had completed her studies with Dewey, had worked in the States, but was half Hawaiian, Louisa Palmer, who was a totally constructivist in her philosophy, and Hartwell-01, which means work and play, and I think actually it was more play. You learn by becoming active and engaged in learning. It's not a matter of absorption. It's a matter of creating the world in your engagement with it. And in Hartwell-01, how that turned out is when they interviewed teachers to see if they were going to be teachers. This is true. It's seriously true. They'd say, how comfortable do you feel with the kids creating the curriculum? And if teachers could answer that coherently, or applicants, then they had a chance. And every year, though, we did have a theme. There was some order in the school. It wasn't just chaos. There was a lot of order, but the kids created a lot of it. But every year there was a theme. And, for example, in third grade, it was the Hawaiians, and we built a Hawaiian village. We really did build a Hawaiian village. We went out. We had a lot of influence from Hawaiians in the staff and in people who came to support. We learned about how that was done. We made the tapa cloth by pounding tapa, which is made out of a root of the same plant that you get poi from. And you pound and pound and pound and pound, and you get a cloth. And then you dye it, and you pound some more. So the school was kind of the foundation of my philosophy about education. My practice of it is that it needs to be really fun. It needs to be aesthetic and engaging and creative, and it's ultimately about the learner and not about the teacher. Yeah, so that's what the school was like, and it was. I mean, we did so many interesting things, and that school continues to exist and continues to flourish with the same set of beliefs. Of course, Louisa Palmer is long gone, but her spirit lives on. But that was through primary grades, and then I shifted into a high school, a junior high school, and then I realized what school was, and that was kind of a shock. It took me a couple of years to recover from that. I was a really poor student for a while, really a rebellious poor student. I said, why are they doing it this way? But I got used to it, finally. But my real love was surfing. The base of my spiritual awareness, my awe and respect and love in the world comes from a lot of things. It comes from the wonderful people who are in schools like Hartwell-01, but it also comes from surfing. And as I got a little older, bigger and bigger waves, until finally I was surfing on 25-foot surf, and that is such an awe, such a humbling experience on one hand. I mean, you gotta be good enough to do it, but your goodness doesn't mean anything in the face of the experience of being on these waves, and the awe and humility that you feel in the experience of going down the face of one of these, or seeing one looming on the horizon and not knowing whether or not it's going to break before it gets to you, and give you a very, very long, tough swim. All of those things meant a lot. Although my father's family had lived in Hawaii for 3 generations. Little diversion. I'm going to tell you something about my great-grandfather, because he really was quite a character, and I wish he was around now. But I describe him as one of the first Peace Corps volunteers in 1860s. After he finished college, he went out and got involved in skirmishes that were going on in Missouri pre-Civil War. and then went back east and joined the 55th Black Regiment. He joined the 55th, which I think most of the listeners will know that the 54th was the basis of the movie Glory. My contention has always been they should have done the movie about the 55th, because it, in fact, was more interesting and it got further. It went all the way to Florida. And it happened that the officers in the black regiments were white. And a lot of the challenge that they had was getting justice for the troops, first during the war and then afterward. And my great-grandfather's correspondence is very large, trying to get the pensions and the payments due to the families, the widows of those. Started out as a junior officer, but all the white seniors were wiped out in the first skirmish in North Carolina, at Honey Hill, and he was left, and he was then promoted, and managed to stay alive. I do still have one of his hats that has a hole in it of a bullet that went right through it, just above his head. But after this, he distinguished himself, and the 55th really did. They got commendations and so forth, but he then got an offer. He'd studied law, and he got an offer from Abraham Lincoln to go to become the legal advisor to King Kalakaua and the monarchy in Hawaii. And it seems that King Kalakaua had heard of the work of this regiment and wanted somebody who basically wasn't a racist. And he didn't know how to, and he did that. And it was kind of and my great-grandfather said great and left. And he stayed out in Hawaii the rest of his life, ended up as Chief Justice, and was involved in the very difficult colonial and post-colonial transitions when the monarchy had to basically relinquish their power. And he was an advisor to that, and it was very, very difficult. But he loved the islands, and so that was our roots. That was in my blood, and still is. Although originally, the family was from New England, Hawaii's okay. But I had too many relatives, though, when I left. I couldn't actually work out there. But my family also, part of because their the background tradition of being in New England, said that either I go out on the streets and fend for myself, or I go to New England for college. And that was really tough. I was making boards. I was doing well on the beach, and I thought that would be okay. But so instead, I had to go back east, and I had to find a place, that met both of my parents' expectations and mine. And I settled up for a small college up in New Hampshire, which does a lot of skiing. And I figured skiing was going to be, my surrogate major. And it was. Although I found, and this is how I got into education, that I couldn't afford it. And so I had to start teaching it. And I started teaching skiing actually the first year I was there. Dartmouth had a good ski school, and I got inducted and trained to be a teacher of beginners right away. And for 4 years I taught skiing as a part of other things that I did there. Can't describe to you the pain and the suffering that I went through that first year in being away from Hawaii. And it wasn't just the surf, it was just the whole culture and ambience. It seems to me in retrospect that I was too harsh on New England, but I found New England materialistic and cold. And in fact, and racist. And that sounds strange, but my two roommates who were dear friends, who became dear friends and with all good intent, sat me down after 2 weeks and went through the yearbook and told me who were people who were not WASPs, which I didn't. Hello, so what? Now in Hawaii, which is so multicultural, multi-ethnic, there are definitely frictions between the Howleys, between the Kama'ainas, the old-timers and the new-timers, the Malahinis. If you go to Hawaii, you're a Malahini, because you're kind of a newcomer. But also the Chinese and the Japanese and the Hawaiians. Most of the Hawaiians were wiped out by smallpox and other diseases, 90% in the late 1800s, 1900s. But those that were left, the Kama'ainas, there were definitely frictions and jokes and all. But, people really lived and accepted together. There was no question of, a white neighborhood. That concept didn't exist. It was an integrated, So while there were, jokes and all that, the idea that you wouldn't actually associate with somebody because of their ethnicity or their race or something was just, pretty much foreign, And all my friend, the group that I hung out with was, ran the whole Chinese, Japanese, Hawaiian, and we didn't think about that. It wasn't. So when I got this message, it really mildly pissed me off. It made and then there was a sense that you went to people's houses on invitation. There was a whole different sense of things. It seemed to be much more formal and cold. I've learned that that's really not the case. We couldn't have more wonderful, better neighbors and friends than we have right here in Amherst. But the first shock of this, with everything else, I describe it, and it was what is called a culture shock. When you go into a new culture, there are a lot of things that at first you think are kind of exotic and interesting. But after a while, they begin to really irritate you. People don't quite maybe show up on time. Or you don't understand what they're saying because of the way they're saying it. Or you have to dress in certain ways. Or if you don't, people look at you a little odd. And all of those things accumulate to give you an increasing level of subconscious irritation, which breaks out in sometimes certain levels of depression and other things called culture shock. And I had, after the culture shock between Hawaii and New Hampshire, everything else in my life has been easy. It's been real. From Dartmouth, a whole lot of things in my undergraduate program. I really loved what I was studying there. The literature, I did literature and philosophy, did pre-med for a couple of years, and came to a really odd conclusion. My father, being a doctor, heart specialist, really wanted me to be in medical school and become a doctor. But I came to a conclusion somewhere about the end of my sophomore year that in the world at large, medicine was very important, but most of it had to do with curing people who had already acquired an illness or a disease, and that we should be focusing on how to prevent that rather than curing it after it. And it seemed to me most of medicine was about how to fix a problem after the problem occurred rather than addressing the problem itself. And that led me into really wanting to do something in the world that prevented not just the problem of health, but health and well-being and learning and education and so forth. And so, although I stayed in philosophy and literature, I was drawn towards teaching and learning. And so I went to Ethiopia after I finished Dartmouth. I joined the Peace Corps as it started. I was actually the second. Another contingent had gone to Ghana about 6 months before I went. And my wife had gone to Ethiopia just before I had, so I didn't know that then. But, so... and Ethiopia sounded perfect. It sounded really exotic and remote and different. And I thought, okay, let's do that. And had a really good intensive language program of learning Amharic, organized by a man named Kurt Leslow, who was then the world expert on the semantics of Amharic. And it turned out Wolf was Wolf was his nickname, actually. Wolf Leslow was probably a fabulous linguist and not that great a teacher. But the good news was that he had Ethiopian assistants. And it was after hours that we learned our Amharic, not so much from the grammatical of Wolf, which goes back to the point that sometimes those who are the best teachers are not that far from where you are and can help you along the way. But I, as it turns out, was posted in Ethiopia. By the way, the training program that time was basically really good. We went in, they got kind of international experts on the culture, the language, the history, the political, economic scene for the countries. And we had an intense period, first at UCLA and then in Addis Ababa. But I was posted to, I was an experiment, actually. I was posted to a remote area of the country. And I mean, you think Ethiopia itself is remote. Well, I was posted to remote Ethiopia, to a place, if any listener cares to look up, Ilubabor province and the town of Gore, Gore. It was in the southwest of the country, about 70 miles from the border of Sudan, at the top of the eastern side of Ethiopia is marked by an escarpment that drops down to the Sudan. It's about 3,000 feet higher in place. There's the waterfall that comes from the Blue Nile, which is Lake Tisisit up in Ethiopia, falls down this and into the Sudan and joins the White Nile, which has come up from Lake Victoria, and it adds a lot of the volume and the force of the river, in the Sudan, and that makes the Nile a pretty. It has rapids. There's that lead then up to Khartoum and north. So Ethiopia is up on this plateau, which is. And this is a serious plateau. Addis Ababa is over 9,000 feet. The town I was at was only at about 6,000, and that was a lowland. So it's really up there, and it's one of the reasons that there's been fundamentally almost no communication with the rest of Africa from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an isolated kingdom, and they even are not sure today how much a part of sub-Saharan Africa they are. But Gore was only reachable by C-47 cargo planes, which are the old DC-3s with no seats in them, and that came once a week sometimes if the weather was good. And its cargo was typically goats and coffee, and a few passengers. It's one of the, according to the people of that region, one of the indigenous areas for coffee. They believe coffee began, it's part of the creation legend, that coffee began in this area. And so every year they have the coffee harvest and the coffee drying in the town, and the whole town has got this wonderful coffee aroma because it's laid out on the mats all over the town and on the stands. So, and then there are trucks that make it there, and the height of the truck tires is like 10 feet. These huge, they're like land demons or something. They're huge tires and things, and they can get out there. So they come out and pick up the coffee, and people get wealthy for a few months and then go back. And this town was an artifact of an earlier age when people could not reach Addis Ababa by rail, as they could after the 1920s. A railway was built from the Red Sea into Addis Ababa. But this town sprung up as on the trade route from the Sudan and the Nile up this escarpment and into Addis that way. And so it had some kind of ancient buildings that were decrepit mostly. But I actually ended up renting one of these for $1 a month and setting up a student hostel. So that was the kids. This was the only school in the whole province of Alubabor at that time that had. There were some primary schools, but this was the only secondary school. And kids would walk 30, 40 miles to come to school. Now, obviously not daily. And then they'd have to find a place to stay. And they could maybe stay with distant relatives or pay some rent and stay with people, often in exchange for work. They were often exploited, sometimes abused. Quite a number of them stayed in what was called the tejbet. And that's bet in Amharic means house, and tej is the local brew. So it was a bar, essentially, and they'd stay in the bar. And that wasn't good for them, obviously. In fact, I was really kind of stymied in one class that I had right after lunch, after the kids came back from their lunch break, because they'd be drunk, half of them. I mean, a good number, because tej was the cheapest thing you could get for nutritional. I mean, it was made out of a lot of grains and it looked like twigs and so on. So it had a nutritional base as well, but it wasn't really good for studying. So we'd have to go run around the courtyard a couple of times before we could actually do much in the classroom. And they came to me and said, why don't we, there's this place that the Southern Sudan Mission, which was an evangelical group of Presbyterian. Well, it was a evangelical group, had tried to buy over an old banking estate, and then had been run out of town by the Coptic Christian establishment because they were too evangelical. And so this place was lying idle, and it had buildings, and it looked like it had a place we could have a small farm garden. And so I went to Addis, and I was able to rent this from them for $1 to have a student hostel. And so we had about 25 students who worked together to rehabilitate this place and do a small garden. And so we had a hostel. And that was fun.
So your primary mission was to teach secondary school?
Right. Yeah. Actually, this was kind of strange. Ethiopia under Haile Selassie in the 60s. Haile Selassie was, although very traditional on one hand, he was very progressive, and I believe a real statesman and a very wise and wonderful man. And he really wanted to modernize the country, and saw education as being fundamental to that. The country was really living, in terms of its economy, its politics, its religion, somewhere in the pre-Renaissance Middle Ages. About 80% of the land was controlled by the church. It was, which operated in a language which nobody except the clergy understood, had immense power, and power was very much concentrated in the hands of the Amharian in few. And it was impossible to talk about agricultural reform without looking at land reform, and that involved the whole structure of things. And so the idea of the education system was they brought in quite a high number of contract Indian teachers, but also, when the Peace Corps started, thought that's the way to get teachers. And by the time I left Ethiopia after 3 years, they had over 1,200 teachers in the schools, which doesn't sound like much, but was almost half the total teaching staff in the secondary schools were American Peace Corps volunteers. And here's the thing about that. The volunteers, myself included, were full of enthusiasm about the world and democracy and voices and rights and critical thought and dialogue. These students went on to university, and in the university they met and became much more aware of the structures and the conditions in the country. And nobody's written a book about this, but here's an opportunity for somebody who knows something about Ethiopia. But the revolution in Ethiopia started in the universities.
Oh, really?
And I don't think you have to look very far to understand why. The students became increasingly dissatisfied with both their future prospects in the overall scheme of things, as well as the way the university was run and managed. And that being said, I think some of the most enlightened and progressive of the Ethiopians, the vice chancellor of the university, was a wonderful man. But this was just a huge sea change, and led, I think, finally to what ended up as a radical Marxist revolution. And I think it was really the dam bursting in terms of the frustrations of a country that was living in the 14th century and also in the 20th. And that those forces just clashed, and the country's still working it out.
Yeah.
All that being said, I loved it out where I was. I was kind of out of the mainstream. Had a horse, and went around. The thing was, they hadn't seen a Mzungu, a white man, for who knows, since the 20s, and those who could remember that. And so when I rode out on my horse, it was, here comes a doctor. People look and say, oh, here comes a doctor. And so that was awkward. And a large proportion of the population suffered from filariasis, elephantiasis, where legs swell because of a disease called filariasis. And sickness was just endemic. I mean, it was worms. We finally got a health person into the village and checked the worm level of the students, and virtually all of them had hookworm and other things. So there was huge health issues there.
Yeah.
And people would ask me for cures. I did consider at one point, pretending I was a doctor, thinking that might be a good idea, doing potions and things. But I didn't do that. I did sometimes dispense aspirin, but that's as far as I got.
Yeah. That was Ethiopia.
Yeah.
You stayed there for how long? 4 years?
Well, no, 3. I stayed on for.
So that was a Peace Corps term?
Well, no, 2 years. But as I said, many of the teachers that the Ethiopia brought in were Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And in the secondary school, all of the teachers except the Amharic teacher were Indian. And there were 5 of them. And the headmaster was an Indian, and he was his wife. He was from Goa. And it seemed that a terrible dispute of uncertain origin arose between the head teacher and everybody else. They just couldn't stand him. And one of the teachers was a Sikh, Mr. Singh, and he was a very slight, lovely man. I became very close friends with he and his wife and their child. They had a girl, and he seemed to be the mildest-mannered person in the world. But the headmaster got it into his head that his life was at stake, and he was being threatened. Whether there was any truth to this, I have no idea. I never got to the bottom of it. But one day, the head teacher picked up with his wife and left. They just didn't announce it. They were just gone. And we said, what happened? We learned that he had taken a flight out that week. And so then we looked around, now what? And they determined that they wanted a head teacher who was going to be absolutely non-threatening. And they chose me. It was really odd. I was it's kind of like, okay, why not? So, but then I agreed to stay on until we could get a replacement, and they did get an Ethiopian to replace me, who was actually a graduate of the agriculture school, and hadn't had teacher training. But I stayed over to overlap with him for about 4 months. And it was good because he wanted to keep up the hostel and the farm, the garden, and so forth. It was with that. But so I stayed 3 years. one of the things I did one of the summers was to help run a teacher training institute for new people coming in to teaching, and met Trish out there. That was in Diradawa, which is the far west of the country, near Somalia. And our first date was a trip over to the ancient city of Harar, which became famous to those who were interested in Victorian literature and Richard Burton's travels and the forbidden city of Harar, because he disguised himself as an Arab and lived there for a year and wrote a book about it. And so it was called the Forbidden City of Harar. So we thought that would be cool to go over to and what we found was it wasn't forbidden really anymore. And most of the people sat around and chewed chat, which is a narcotic, and means that most of the population was spaced out. So it was pretty sad, actually, although colorful. But that's a narcotic that is used really widely. In fact, it's probably Ethiopia's first export, although they don't admit it. But it's not violent like heroin, but it's just a slow deterioration in capacity. That's sad.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I got an offer to join a project in Washington D.C. to work out of. There were a number of schools involved, but I was to work out of a high school to help work and develop a new curriculum that would be in social studies and English, particularly, that would be based on the lives of the kids going to school, rather than just the standard high school curriculum. And they were recruiting some return volunteers because they figured that after what we'd be through, we could do anything. You know, it was also in the Kennedy era when things were. There's still a kind of an optimism about how you could transform the inner city, and this was a part of it. So, accepted that and went to Washington D.C. I had in Ethiopia a teacher. Oh, there's something else before I get to Washington D.C. I really want to mention. One of the teachers who was assigned the second year I was there was an Ethiopian who had recently graduated from the university, and was had a philosophical. He loved long discussions and about the state of the world and the state of Ethiopia and the state of mankind. And we had a good time together. And after a couple of times we were having dinner together, and he told me that he had lived in Connecticut with a family that he really loved. He said they were just wonderful. And he said, and they were something called Baha'is. And he said, you would really be interested in these people. And he said, I have some of their books that they gave me. And he handed me a book called Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah and The Hidden Words. And I thought, oh, this looks interesting, you know. And so anyway, we had long and intense discussions about religion, about politics, about the state of the world, and basically lamented the fact that, although one has to remember the 60s was a period of real optimism, although we were out, I mean, the optimism only little reached us out where we were, but it was and these writings and the thoughts seemed to be revolutionary in their insistence on the notion that the world will get itself together when it achieves unity. And that really hit me out in Gori Ilubabor. Who's saying this? And the thing was that the writings were clearly deep and powerful, but you needed to talk to somebody who could help you with them. I was drawn to them, but that's all I mean at that point, and wondered.
Right.
Later, of course, the Baha'i faith in Ethiopia became very rooted and very strong, and has a wonderful, vibrant community today.
Oh,
yeah. We have a very active community of youth and people who are doing things in the country that are wonderful. So I learned that much later. But,
I see.
Yeah. So
you're back in Washington, D.C.
Back in Washington. working in a school which is Cardozo High School, which named after a great judge, but was the pits. After Ethiopia, it was really a shock, in a way. I mean, Gori Ilubabor, Ethiopia, is very poor. People, it's from hand to mouth. There's a lot of sickness. But, people look after each other. I mean, it's not that poverty, maybe it reflects larger world context, but in D.C., the poverty clearly reflects the effect of racism, without question. And that was so evident in the school, with the kids. By the way, this is about now, I'm talking about 66, Black Panthers, the the work in the South. Stokely Carmichael is nearby, comes into my class, by the way.
Oh, really?
I mean, it was before he became Stokely. He was just really angry and hugely articulate. So we're really aware of what's, of changes that are starting to take place. I was teaching classes. We had a much reduced load. We only had 2 classes, and in the classes we were expected to develop a curriculum that reflected the realities out on the street and in the world of the kids, so that it would become much more relevant to them. So the choices of the literature, the poetry, and the rest of it. I mean, we had to follow generally the idea that we're teaching literature and reading and writing, but we were left completely open. And we had a fabulous team. This is called the Cardozo Project. There was a team of about 14 people. We had 3 master teachers, and the head of the project was a man named Larry Cuban, who had come out of Cleveland as a really innovative social science teacher, did a lot of work with simulations and role-playing, and was just... And Larry went on after this project, by the way, to become superintendent in Arlington, then to finish a doctorate in history in Yale, and go on to become a professor at Stanford, and become the head of AERA, the American Education Research, is a really a major player, and still is today, although he's now retired. Fabulous guy. I mean, to watch a class by Larry, he just said, "Oh, that's the way you teach." He just was so energetic, but energetic in having the students become engaged and energetic, and he constantly did. He had kids in 10th grade who were hardly literate, looking at original documentation from the Bunker Hill, the first shot of the Revolution, and study and become, to model the life and times of Crispus Attucks and so on. And I mean, and they did, and they really got into this and said, "Hey, this is a street, this is a street thing," and it kind of was then. It was pretty rough. Not this kind of, in this date such and such happened. He was just hugely. So we had mentors and models, and we're really encouraged to think outside the box. The other thing about this thing was that we constantly sat in and watched each other and critiqued. We also spent a lot of time on the street. With social workers, going to homes. We met we went and introduced and talked with all the parents of our kids. I mean, we went in squad cars, patrols. It was worked out so that it was part of an urban sociology or Afro-American literature combined master's degree program at Howard. And so we were getting some really good stuff from that too. So it was a good program in terms of getting engaged, and it made us realize this school, Cardozo, of the 600 or so graduating seniors, 1 or 2 might get on to the university. That's ridiculous. I mean, this is just these. A friend of ours, Nat Rudstein, wrote a book with a subtitle called "Mental Genocide." And that book is a description of the of what it's like for a male Afro-American adolescent in in an inner city school, in most inner city schools, in terms of the assault on their dignity. That sounds pretty odd.
Yeah, it's true.
They're just the disregard of them as full human beings with agency. And in the class I walked into, the first class I walked into in 10th grade, 80% of those kids were functionally illiterate. It was just outrageous, and they were angry as hell. Although they couldn't show it in the school because the school was a prison for them. They had to go. They got beaten all the time from their parents because they missed. It was just awful. And after the Ethiopian experience, I just putting this into context. I had a teacher. Not the same teacher, another teacher who I had known in Ethiopia, an Ethiopian, who came to Washington, D.C., and I invited him over to sit in on one of the classes. And at the end of the class, he just couldn't believe it. He said that these kids, they don't want to be here. They hate this place. This is so different from Ethiopia. And it was true. I had a fabulous experience in Ethiopia because the kids were so motivated. And here, it was like we were more jailers than teachers. And although we could do stuff with the curriculum, a bunch of us got together and said, we've got to do something else here. This isn't responsible just to say we're going to change the curriculum. So we started 2 programs, more or less at the same time. And then we had support for this. One was called New Careers for the Poor. I mean, that was the rubric under which we got funds, and it was done with Howard University. And it was to have kids who had dropped out by 10th or 11th grade, offer them the equivalent of a high school diploma and training to fit into new jobs. And these were jobs that were being developed through health services, hospital, outpatient clinics, and so forth, and schools, teacher aides. Those didn't exist then. With the idea that we needed cultural brokers, that the communities needed somebody they could trust to talk to about what was happening. The schools and the hospitals and the health services did a terrible job of communicating with the community. They were whitey establishments. And so this was a program to have people who could talk both languages. Now, that wasn't very easy with dropouts because they had to agree that that was something that they wanted to do and to learn how to do it. And that raised up a whole lot of issues that many of the problems kids were having in school weren't operational or functional, but they were cultural, or they were arising out of racism. That if on the street you spoke like a white man, you weren't going to survive long.
Right.
So, but when you came into school, you were being forced to do that, and so that it had to do with issues of identity and meaning, and my purpose in life, and who am I, and who cares, and who values me, and who doesn't, and why. And the kids in this program had to sort those issues out, and so we did a lot of group work, which wasn't a subject; it was working through these issues. And a lot of time was spent on that, very interestingly. The program worked. Almost 35 kids completed their high school diplomas and got into work in these services. And later these services became a part of the establishment. So that was good. The other was a program called Upward Bound, which was just starting, and that was giving kids who, again, seemed to be performing much below their capacity in poverty situations, a chance to go to university by having a program during the summer and during the year that gave them a different view of what the university might be. And so I actually became the director of that at the University of Maryland. While I was also doing that. And we had 120 kids, but we had to have an integrated program. And Cardozo didn't have anybody white at all. And so we had to go to southern Baltimore to find white kids. That was the closest. And in southern Baltimore, at Southern High School, about 40% of the kids were white, and they were mostly from migrants from Appalachia. where the mines had shut down.
Mm.
And boy, that was a case, because these families were really dysfunctional. I mean, they amount of alcoholism and abuse. Oh my gosh! And the kids that we chose, we had such respect for. They looked like they were really problem kids, but we had a lot of respect for them because they had survived. And that program, we decided there was no way we were going to start this program in classrooms. This would be a terrible signal.
Right.
So we did something else. We thought, we got together. We had a great team, and we got together and decided we were going to do a 3-week survival mountain camping out in up in the very far reaches of western Maryland, up by West Virginia. And it's going to be a survival camping. And that's what we did. And we said to everyone, if you want to be in this, you've got to be ready to try to survive in an environment you've never experienced. Because these kids had never been on a camping trip. They're not. There's no Boy Scouts in Cardozo.
Right. Right.
And so we went off, and that was really interesting, very tough. I mean, we didn't know that we were going to make it, actually.
Really?
I mean, just because of the... most adolescents, you think they know something about camping, but these guys... making a fire, except for arson, there was just, there were completely... It was a culture shock. We used an outward bound approach, but, people coming into outward bound have a lot of history usually behind them, and we just realized this is really tough. In fact, it was so tough that in the second week, one of the things we did was we didn't do solo. The Outward Bound program has kids after about a month. They go for a 3-day solo where they don't take anything with them, and they go for a period of meditation and personal survival and coming to account with themselves, their spiritual realities, and God, if they believe in that. We couldn't kind of replicate that. But what we did do was have groups of 3 people go out for a 2-day and an overnight. And each person could carry one thing. Apart from the clothes they wore, that was it. So if somebody forgot matches, unless they were really clever, and nobody was, they wouldn't get a fire. We had these, and I was in about the 4th, and we had a staff person as one of the 3. We didn't want to be completely irresponsible here. And so the group I was on, the 3 of us set off, and that night was the worst storm in the history of Western Maryland.
Oh, boy.
Thunder and lightning. It was just amazing. I didn't think we were going to survive. We had hiked about 6 hours off, and we were on a mountainside. And at this point, there was lightning fall, and all around us. Also, I had a scratch in my leg down by my ankle, and we had the earlier week had gone to swim in the Chesapeake. And that night, for one reason or another, I felt this thing starting to give me some pain, like it was getting infected. And it seemed to be getting worse through the night, but I thought it couldn't be. One of the group had a flashlight, and when they flashed, the leg swollen, and there was a lump and a line going up my lane, and my lane was looking discolored.
Oh, boy.
And that was like at about 8 o'clock. And about 11 o'clock, it had gone almost up to my knee, and it was clear this was really, whatever it was really bad. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like an organism had gotten in there and was burrowing north, and I couldn't stand quite properly. And so we were freaked out, actually.
I can imagine.
And the other 2 kids got under each of my arms and got me. We walked out, getting back to camp around dawn later. And by then my leg was really discolored, and they had to take me to the emergency room. And I had a streptococcus infection, which the hospital put me immediately in intensive care. And nobody could get in or out of that room unless they were totally covered in plastic. And The kids had saved me. I mean, this was a deal.
Yeah.
There was no act of leadership that would have been more effective, I think, than this. Being totally helpless and being rescued by the kids.
Yeah.
Talk about agency.
Did that transform the kid?
The kids came back from camping. I got back out to the camp before it was finally closed down with crutches and all, and I slowly recovered. Out of the 120 kids who were on that program, just over 100 went into some form of post-secondary education, and about 80 went on to full universities. And we kept track of them over the years, and one of them became the president of the University of Maryland.
Really?
Yeah, a young woman.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty
So,
good.
I mean, this was 120 kids. Over 100 went on to tertiary education, whereas 2 out of 600 in Cardozo went. And it's not because we were brilliant. We just cared about the kids.
Right.
We cared about each other and wanted to give them an opportunity. And it shows, and this still is true. I mean, one would have thought that there were a lot of things that schools might have been able to do, but they haven't. The inner city schools are not that much different today. And that's just a reflection of our society. It's not a reflection of what we could do, but what we have chosen to do.
Chosen not to do.
Chosen not to. Yeah. I think everybody ought to be absolutely clear that this is a social decision. It's not a. It's not a question of that the communities are intractable or that the kids can't learn. That's all bull. They can and they do, and so on. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Ash Hartwell, a Baha'i from Amherst, Massachusetts, who has traveled to many parts of the world as a consultant on education. We have more stories to come from Ash for future segments. If you want information on the Baha'i Faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org. Or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. I hope you'll join me next time on A Baha'i Perspective.
Become as the waves of one sea, stars of the same heaven, fruits adorning the same tree, roses of one garden, in order that through you the oneness of humanity may establish its temple in the world of mankind. May you become as the waves of one sea, stars of the same heaven, fruits adorning the same tree, roses of one garden, in order that through you the oneness of humanity may establish its temple in the world of mankind. La 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 la
This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free Radio station.